When I told my mother-in-law I was going back to my hometown to give birth, by all means, go back. I don't want to see your face.
By all means, go back. I don't want to see your face.
I was delighted from the bottom of my heart as I was waiting for those words.
You won't have to see me anymore, rest assured.
What?
I am Emily, about to turn 28. My mother died from illness when I was only 2. Since my father, a busy man, ran a clothing company with a 100-year-old tradition, I was looked after by my grandmother as he worked. My father was very strict, and I lived my life just as he told me to. Perhaps because of that I had never dated a man. But I had given up, thinking it was destiny. After graduating from college, I worked briefly as my father's secretary at his company, but he said it was hard for him to work together, and forced me to quit. I didn't get a job after that, because my father strongly stated that I don't need to work. However, my friends from university got jobs and started dating and getting married one after another. So I wanted to work too. I told my father one night, "Dad, can I work?"
Dad, can I work?
No,
He said one word without asking for a reason.
Why not?
because you don't need to work.
But I also need to go out into society and gain more experience.
Emily, don't talk back.
I'm not talking back. I'm not saying anything wrong.
You should just stay at home, Emily.
If you say that, I'll leave home. I'll leave home and go to work from there.
Emily, stop it.
No, I am an adult. I won't always do as you say.
I cried and left the place. Even in my room, I cried for a long time. After a while, I called my friend from college, Lisa. "Can I come to your house now?"
Sure, but what's wrong? And can you go out at this time?
"I can't right now, but I'll figure it out." "Can I stay at your place for a while?"
That's fine. Just be careful on your way here.
Quietly, I pulled out my suitcase, packed my belongings, and stealthily left the house so as not to alert my father. I left a note on my desk stating that I was going to stay with a friend. Once outside, I hailed a taxi and headed towards Lisa's apartment. Upon arriving at Lisa's apartment, I was greeted with my favorite coffee that she had prepared.
Thank you, Lisa.
What's going on, Emily?
I explained everything about the argument with my father and my subsequent departure from home.
That's awful, Emily. You've had no freedom at all.
Her words brought tears to my eyes once again.
Until now, I did everything my father said and thought it was normal. But suddenly I've started craving my own freedom.
That's completely normal. It's strange that your father doesn't allow you to work.
I'd like to meet many people and have a good time too.
So, does your dad know you're here?
I left a note saying I was going to a friend's place, but he doesn't know any of my friends.
He might be frantically searching for you right now.
Maybe.
It's late now. Shall we go to bed?
Yeah, I'm really tired.
Lisa prepared a separate room for me to sleep in.
The next day, Lisa left for work. When I checked my phone, I saw about 10 missed calls from my dad. I felt sorry for him, and I sent him an email to assure him not to worry. In the evening, after Lisa finished work, she called me.
I'm going out for a drink. Why don't you join us?
Having little experience with social drinking, I was excited about going out. When I arrived at the location Lisa mentioned, I found her waiting with 2 men.
Sorry for keeping you waiting. So who are these gentlemen?
This is my boyfriend, and the tall guy over there, he's single and ready to mingle.
The tall man introduced himself with a refreshing smile.
Nice to meet you, I'm Max. Pleased to make your acquaintance.
Oh, nice to meet you. I'm Emily.
That's how our relationship started. Max worked at a small company in the apparel industry. For a moment, I thought it was a company similar to my father's, but I quickly dismissed the thought. Max's family was the opposite of mine, with only his mother around, but he didn't discuss the reason, and I didn't ask. One day, Max said to me, "I'd like to meet your father, Emily." I had been emailing my father several times since I left home, but I had no intention of going back home yet, so I didn't want to meet him.
I'll think about it, but I would like to meet your mom, Max.
Sure, when? Even today is fine if you want.
Really? Today's fine? Then I should buy some kind of gift.
Yeah, my mom loves that kind of thing.
As I found out later, my mother-in-law didn't just love that kind of thing, she got very cranky if I bought her a gift. On the way to Max's house, I bought a cake at a bakery. Upon arrival at Max's house, my mother-in-law was waiting for us at the front door. When I asked Max why his mother was there, He told me he had sent her a message from the bakery. My mother-in-law stared at me and asked, "And your name is?"
I'm Emily. Nice to meet you.
What do you do for a living?
I'm currently unemployed, but I plan to work soon.
Oh, so you're just idling about? How nice it must be to be a rich young lady.
I'm not rich. That's why I want to work.
You don't need to talk back. What do your parents do?
My mother passed away when I was young. My father works at a company.
Max, who had been watching my conversation with his mother from the side, said, "How long are you two going to talk here? Let's go inside."
Right. By the way, Max, did she bring anything? Surely she didn't come empty-handed.
In a rush, I handed my mother-in-law the paper bag containing the cake.
This isn't much, but
Grabbing the bag almost violently from my hand, she peered inside and commented, "I didn't really need anything, but I guess I'll take it."
In the few minutes I had spent talking to my mother-in-law, I had grown to despise her. And I felt sorry for anyone who had to call such a person mother-in-law. Entering the living room, my mother-in-law bombarded me with questions, and I gave her only bland answers. Regardless, she continued to interrogate me relentlessly, almost as if I were a criminal suspect. Exhausted by the barrage of one-sided questions, I told Max the moment her line of questioning eased.
Max, I think I should go soon.
At that, my mother-in-law's face turned red with anger. "Do you really hate being with me that much? You've been giving me half-hearted replies to my questions this whole time."
Mom, please calm down.
"Max, why on earth did you bring such a rude woman here? There must be better women out there."
I snapped back at her. What about me is rude, exactly? If there's something I should improve, then tell me so I can work on it.
That seemed to incense my mother-in-law even further. "You're quite cheeky, aren't you? All you have to do is answer my questions. I've been answering everything you've asked. You dislike me, don't you? I can see it in your face."
I wanted to say yes, but I couldn't.
I'm just tired and would like to go home.
"Well, aren't you audacious? I wonder what kind of education your parents gave you."
They must have been good parents. I would love to see what they look like.
Hearing her badmouth my parents, I was overwhelmed with sadness and began to cry.
Oh dear, now you're crying for sympathy, Dad? If you want to go home so badly, then go. It will be a breath of fresh air. Also, I'm going to feed this cake you brought to my dog, Charlie. But Charlie is quite a pampered pooch, so he might not eat such a cheap cake.
Laughing, my mother-in-law pointed at the cake I had bought.
Mom, enough is enough.
Max, you really have no eye for women.
Why are you always so argumentative? Can't you act more mature for once?
Max shot back, causing his mother to lose her energy instantly.
All I want is a good wife for you, Max. I get that, but I'm an adult too, you know. I'm not a kid anymore, so I can handle my own stuff.
Hearing Max's words, his mother's eyes filled with tears, and she left the room. With a teary face, I decided to leave too, but Max followed me and apologized.
Emily, I'm sorry for all the harsh words my mom said. She must be jealous, thinking that she's losing me to you. I'll talk to her about this, okay? Please don't let this discourage you from coming again.
I'm really hurt by what your mother said about my parents, Max. I don't want to see your mother again. The moment I said that, a wave of sadness overwhelmed me and I burst into tears, throwing myself into Max's arms. Max held me close and after a while suggested, "How about we go somewhere now?" Barely nodding, I left the house with Max. Since Max didn't have a car, we took the train and got off at a station by the beach. We sat on a bench on the sandy beach, staring at the sea for a long time. 2 months passed since then. I found out that I was pregnant. When I consulted Max about it, he proposed, "Let's get married. We don't have to have a ceremony, but we'll make it official. We can live at my house, okay? I don't make much money at my job, so I can't afford to rent an apartment. I'll make sure to talk to my mom about not saying unnecessary things to you, Emily." Living with his mother wasn't ideal for me, but there was no other place to live. "Okay, I'll try my best to get along with your mother." Thus, I ended up living with my mother-in-law. Because I was getting married, I went back home to tell my father about it. He looked delighted when he saw me.
It's good to see you looking well. I know we've been in touch, but it's been a while since I last saw you.
I'm sorry, Dad. I have something important to tell you.
My father's expression changed immediately. I told him about my encounter with Max, my pregnancy, and our plan to get married. My father listened silently. When I finished, he simply said, "Well, congratulations. Can't wait to meet my grandchild."
His smile looked forced.
Dad, thank you. I'm sorry for bringing such sorrow as a daughter.
I said as tears flowed down my face. My dad was also crying. I expected him to be angry, but his gentle words hurt me even more. I ended up moving into my mother-in-law's house.
You better show me your cute baby's face soon.
Yeah, of course. And you should get married soon, too.
I want to get married soon too, but he just won't make up his mind. But I think it'll work out somehow.
Let's go out for dinner together again.
I planned to move on Sunday, but my mother-in-law said it was a bad luck day, so I changed it to Saturday. The move was completed safely on Saturday morning. While the movers were carrying my belongings, my mother-in-law just stood there, watching them. She was repeatedly told by the movers to step back because it was dangerous, but she wouldn't move. When the move was over, my mother-in-law called me over and said, "You didn't give them what they're supposed to get, right?"
That?
It seemed she misunderstood me, pretending not to know, and she went away and handed something to the leaders of the movers. Seeing that I understood what she was saying, but when she came back to me, she said, "Emily dear, it seemed like you didn't want to part with your money, so I gave it for you. Of course you'll pay me back later." She then told me an absurd amount of money. It was way beyond what was generally considered reasonable, so I said, "You gave them that much?"
Oh dear, was that bad? It's not bad, but I think the amount was a little too much.
It's the thought that counts in these situations. If you skimp, you'll be cursed.
I'm not saying I'm skimping.
I didn't say anything more because I knew it would lead to another argument. My mother-in-law had this face saying, "I'm right, no matter what you say." That's when Max showed up and said to my mother-in-law, "Mom, what's up?" "What did you say to Emily?"
Mom, what did you say to Emily? Just nothing.
My mother-in-law replied succinctly, then walked off.
"You okay?" "I told her not to mess with you, you know."
Thanks.
Deciding not to mention to Max that I almost had another argument with my mother-in-law. I knew if I did, he might mention it to her, causing her to grow even more hostile towards me. After moving in, my mother-in-law barely spoke to me, obviously avoiding me. There were even weeks when she wouldn't utter a word to me, and those days were bliss. One day, Max brought home some work documents in an envelope. It was marked with a company name, Star Textiles Inc., and that made me gasp. That was a name I had heard many times during my time working for my dad's company. They were one of our subcontractors. I asked Max, "Is this your company's envelope?"
Yeah, why?
I was just wondering. I just realized that I didn't know much about your company.
I didn't tell him that his company was a subcontractor to my father's. For some reason, I felt it was better not to say anything.
Well, we're just a small subcontractor. If our parent company decided to drop us, we'd go bankrupt instantly, and all the employees would lose their jobs.
Max laughed with this, his wistful look. About a month later, Max started coming home late from work. He also seemed down, so I asked him, "You've been coming home late recently. Is something wrong? You don't seem yourself."
He admitted and said, "The company's in trouble.
What, like going bankrupt?
Max nodded.
The parent company suddenly decided to cut our orders by half. Now our boss is begging them every day to continue business as usual. We're also looking for new clients. But if neither of those things work out, we're going bankrupt."
As I listened to Max's story, I thought about asking my dad to help Max's company. But my father is strict about his work, so he would never help a business partner out of personal feelings. For some reason, the number of business partners must have been halved. I told him that my father's company is the parent company of Max's.
Max was surprised at first, but then he told me with a twinkle in his eyes, "Emily, please, beg your father not to reduce his business with us."
I'm sorry, Max. My father is strict in business. He would never make such a decision based on personal matters.
Could you at least try, Emily?
It won't help.
As I said this, Max got down on his knees before me.
Please, I beg you.
Stop it, Max. Don't do this. I'll talk to my father, but I know it won't make a difference.
As Max raised his head, tears of relief streamed down his face. That night, I called my father and explained Max's desperate plea.
So the company Max works for is Star Textiles. I guess I have to help them then.
I was surprised. I had expected my father, with his strict business mindset, to refuse outright.
But I have two conditions. First, I will continue to do business with Star Textiles as before. But I want Max to leave that company and work for mine. Second, you and Max will move in with me. Is that acceptable?
So you're saying Max should transfer to your company? I'll talk to him about that. But why do you want us to live with you?
My father answered, sounding a bit uncomfortable.
I just want my daughter close by.
Okay, but why did you decide to reduce your dealings with Star Textiles in the first place?
A new company approached us with a very attractive proposal, so we decided to do business with them. But after some research, we found out that they have a history of breaking promises. So we were planning to call off the deal.
So even if I hadn't asked, Star Textiles would have been fine.
Maybe.
My father laughed, and I couldn't help but laugh too. After hanging up, I immediately relayed the conditions my father had proposed to Max. He was relieved that Star Textiles was no longer in jeopardy, but he seemed hesitant about moving to my father's company.
It's hard for me to consider working for your father's company, Emily. I've always worked hard at Star Textiles, and I have a lot of good colleagues.
I'll tell my father what you said.
I called my father again, and when I relayed what Max had said, my father responded,
He indeed said that? Tess, he's a responsible, good man. Got it? He can keep doing his best at Star Textiles. But I'm not backing down about you guys moving into my house.
Hey, understood.
After the phone call, Max was overjoyed when I told him what my father had said. I told Max, just remember, don't let your mother know about my father's company. If she finds out, she'll start nagging again.
Wait, got it.
Several weeks later, I decided to go back home for the birth of our child. Even though it's just my father and elderly grandmother at home, it's way better than being taken care of by my mother-in-law. I waited until my mother-in-law was having her afternoon tea in the living room, and I approached her.
Mother-in-law, about my childbirth, I've decided to go back home. It's just my dad and my grandmother, but my grandma is still very active and full of energy.
When I said this, my mother-in-law looked at me with hateful eyes and said, by all means, go back. I don't want to see your face.
I didn't feel anything when my mother-in-law said this, as I had anticipated it.
You won't have to see me anymore, so rest easy.
What?
I mean, I won't be coming back here anymore. And soon Max will be moving to my parents' house as well.
What are you talking about? Max is too busy with work to move.
It's okay now.
At that moment, Max came in and said to his mother, Mom, my company is going to be okay now. Emily helped me.
What are you talking about?
Emily's dad is the owner of my company's parent company.
What? What?
Hearing this, my mother-in-law raised her voice and stared at me for a while before saying, Emily, I had no idea you were the daughter of the owner of a parent company of Max's. I've been very rude to you up until now.
My mother-in-law bowed deeply. It's okay now. May I ask you for a favor? I'd like to live together at your parents' house as well.
Mom, no, you can stay here.
Yeah, I don't want to live with you, mother-in-law. I'd be reminded of all the things you've said to me up until now.
I won't say anything else, please. I beg you.
My mother-in-law said with tears in her eyes.
I know it seems cold, but that's not possible.
Then, my mother-in-law got on her knees, bowed her head to the floor and pleaded, Please, I don't want to live without Max. Please.
No, I can't.
Mom, stop it. If you had been kind to Emily before, we could have lived together, but your past behavior has led to this. Give it up.
I told my mother-in-law, who continued to shed tears on the floor, Well, mother-in-law, you brought this on yourself. Half a year later, Max, our newborn daughter Kay, and I visited my mother-in-law's house. However, the house was void of any human presence and the air was chillingly cold. Max was calling out loudly to his mother, but there was no response.
Max, did you mention we were coming over?
No, I thought it'd be a surprise.
I wonder where she is.
Just then, my mother-in-law, who had become severely emaciated, came out of the bathroom. Even upon seeing us, she did not change her expression. The kitchen was piled high with remnants of instant noodles and dirty dishes were left stacked.
Mom, are you okay?
My mother-in-law glanced at Max, but said nothing.
Mother-in-law, we brought your favorite cake.
As I held out the cake, my mother-in-law rushed towards me, snatched the cake, and began devouring it immediately. I repeated what I had said before.
Well, mother-in-law, you brought this on yourself.
My wife was an office worker at my client's company. At the time, being young, I was drawn to her quiet demeanor. I approached her fervently, and we started dating. 2 years later, I went to her parents' home to seek their approval for our marriage. There, her father unexpectedly suggested that we live with them. Originally from a rural island, I moved to the city for college and fell in love with a small town during my studies. After graduation, I obtained a professional license and started my own practice in the town. Believing that it's essential to be part of the community, I actively participated in the local homeowners association, night paroles, local festivals, and other events. This helped me build a network of trust, and as a result, secure a steady income. It was only because my earning had become stable that I could muster the courage to marry my wife. Therefore, even though my in-laws' place is only an hour and a half away by train, I couldn't leave here where I was working. Despite explaining this multiple times, my father-in-law persistently pushed us to move in with them. Being a former civil servant, he started saying that he could use his connections to help me find a job. Although I appreciated the offer, I wanted to prioritize taking care of my current clients. I insisted on this for several hours. Finally, I disclosed my current income to my father-in-law and explained that without the relationships I had built so far, I wouldn't be where I am today. And if I were able to expand my business in the future and establish it in their area, I wouldn't mind moving in. Eventually, my father-in-law grudgingly agreed. During this whole discussion, everyone except my father-in-law was as silent as the air. No one interrupted the conversation, and my mother-in-law brought tea a few times. My sister-in-law was there at first, but had to leave midway due to work. After getting married for convenience, I bought a condo near the station about a 20-minute walk away from my office. My wife, whom we'll call Emily, said she wanted to continue working and stayed as an office worker. However, after about a year, she suddenly quit her job to get her own professional license, saying she wanted to help me with my business. The exam was tough, but I could see her determination, and I thought it would be better if we could do it as a couple. So I agreed and let her attend a vocational school. However, she almost abandoned household chores while she was studying. Although I let that slide, our relationship temporarily turned tense. Within less than a year, Emily struggled to keep up with her classes and became a stay-at-home wife. She seemed calmer than when she was studying, and our relationship became better again. At one point, I thought it was a marital crisis, so I expressed my love for Emily even more and worked harder. Eventually, Emily became pregnant and gave birth to twin sons, but she began to act strangely from since then. On my days off from work, she would leave the kids and go back to her family's home by herself. At first, she said she wanted to take a break from parenting, and since both of them had started drinking milk formula, and not just breast milk, I was able to take care of them. So I agreed. We had many talks about this, but my wife said she just couldn't tend to 2 kids at once, and since they're boys, she expected me to parent them. I couldn't quite agree, but for the sake of our children, I relocated my office to a closer location and converted it to an office with kids' playroom. We've been visiting my in-laws about once a month, but the last time we went to, my in-laws just wouldn't let us leave. I turned down drinks, telling them that I was driving, but they still served me beer, calling it tea. I could tell from the smell right away, so I didn't drink a sip. By the time our children were 3 to 4 years old, they weren't attached to Emily at all, and stuck to me instead. Eventually, Emily began to visit my in-laws, even on weekdays, and at times she would even spend a week or 2 at their place and not come back. When it started to interfere with my work, I consulted with Emily's family, but the talks with Emily's mother didn't go anywhere because Emily herself wanted to be there. Emily's father didn't answer the phone, so when Emily hadn't come back for a week, I decided to leave my children at daycare and went to my in-laws' place. When I got to their place, I could hear a loud argument even from outside. From outside, it seemed that my father-in-law and sister-in-law were yelling at each other. Hesitating a bit, I killed time at a nearby convenience store, and when I visited again, the voices had quieted down. So I rang the doorbell at my in-laws' home. The front door opened and Emily's sister came out right away, held back by Emily's father, with Emily's mother, and Emily just watching. Emily's sister said to me, "Let's go out. I'll tell you everything."
To which my father-in-law said to me, "What are you talking about? Come in quickly."
However, Emily's sister and my father-in-law were having a fierce argument at the entrance, so I couldn't enter their place. During a heated argument, it seems a neighbor called the cops, and the police arrived to cool things down. We ended up talking at their place. According to my father-in-law, Emily constantly being at her parents' house is your fault. Don't listen to your sister-in-law, Susan. She's crazy. But Susan snickered and said, "You've been deceiving Frank from the start, haven't you?" But every time Susan tried to talk, my father-in-law would interrupt and make a fuss. So we couldn't really have a proper conversation. Even when I tried to get Emily to join in, she remained silent. This was going nowhere, so I asked to talk to everyone individually on a later date. To this, my father-in-law made an unbelievable accusation. "You're planning to have an affair with Susan, aren't you?"
Upon hearing this, Susan stood up and said, "Fine, that's enough. I'm leaving this house. Be prepared to cut ties with me."
Then she walked out of the room. No one else followed her, but I followed her to the door. Susan, with a serious look on her face, handed me a small envelope and urged me to go back inside. After tucking the envelope inside my jacket, I went back to the room where my father-in-law began again. "Looks suspicious, ain't it? You better move in here quickly."
I myself was running out of time, and I had to pick up my kids, so I calmly said, "We've already discussed this before we got married. I don't have Susan's number, and I only meet her here. It's getting late, so I'm taking Emily home today."
Then I promptly had Emily gather her things and we headed home. In the car on our way home, I talked with Emily, but she kept repeating, "The kids don't like me. I don't understand boys. I'm useless."
Since I still loved Emily, I told her, "Stay with the kids as much as you can. Raise them in your own way, and I want you to be by my side."
We picked up our kids from the daycare and went home. All ate together. Emily's cooking skills had declined, but it was still better than mine, and the kids seemed happy eating it. After dinner, unusually, the kids clung to Emily, and Emily smiled and played with them until they all fell asleep together. I had work to do for tomorrow, so I went to my office to organize some documents. That's when I remembered the envelope Susan had given me. Inside was a USB drive. When I checked it on my office PC, it contained text and audio files. The text file was a summary of my father-in-law's living together plan. Knowing that I was self-employed and earning reasonably well compared to my peers, Emily's father planned to have me move in and work from home, and have me contribute my earnings to them. Despite the initial disagreements when we first met, my father-in-law seemingly believed we would eventually agree to live together, and had even bought a luxury car on loan. However, he saw no signs of Emily and I moving in. So Emily's father had the idea to get Emily a professional license, but her failing the exam thwarted his plan. Still, Emily's father couldn't give up on my income. After Emily gave birth, he came up with a plan to take Emily away from me and manipulated her to get her on his side. Since there was still no sign of us moving in, my father-in-law thought that if he could push the kids onto me, even on weekdays, we would have to rely on them. However, I had set up a childcare room in my office. The next step, apparently, was to keep my wife Emily at home, waiting for me to buckle under the pressure and suggest we live together. The voice file recorded my father-in-law bragging to Emily, Emily's mother, and Emily's sister about the plan, as well as insults towards me and Emily when things went wrong. Emily's mother accepting this, Emily agreeing, and threatened to Emily's sister when she tried to intervene. There were also commands telling Emily to get her hands on my money and to bring that money over, to which Emily only responded with, "Understood." But Emily's sister's opposition was also recorded. Lastly, there was a separate message from Emily's sister, and there was something shocking written there. Apparently, in that house, if they stood up against their father, he would punish them by starvation and economic abuse. Emily's sister often stood up to such a father, and every time she did, she received unthinkable harassment, such as being denied meals and not being given lunch money. Emily, who grew up seeing this, obediently obeyed her father. To stand up to her father, Emily's sister had been learning judo from the upper grades of elementary school. Of course, Emily's father didn't provide the money, but because she was good at it, a police officer relative allowed her to go to the police station dojo. When Emily's sister was in her first year of high school, she was almost assaulted by Emily's father, of course in a sexual way. But Emily's sister, who had been training, fended off Emily's father, and it seems there was never another attack after that. However, the way Emily's father looked at and behaved towards Emily was strange, so Emily's sister suggested Emily learn judo as well, but Emily gave up as her parents were against it. After graduating high school, Emily's sister got a job and saved as much money as possible. The plan was to eventually take Emily and run away from their parents' house. But Emily, who was raised too obediently, didn't know how to stand up for herself. I have a feeling Emily's been assaulted by my father-in-law when she was in high school, but there's no evidence. When Susan was at home, Emily would cling to her. So when Emily one day told her sister that she had someone she liked and had been asked out, Susan was truly surprised. At first, Susan would secretly watch them on dates. If he turned out to be a weird guy, she was ready to rescue Emily right away. When my father-in-law proposed the cohabitation plan, she thought I would be all right because I had strongly refused. But after seeing Emily's father's obsession, Emily's sister thought it would be best to leave some evidence for the future. Now Emily might be assaulted by our father, Susan felt, and she wants me to help Emily as soon as possible. She is sure she can protect herself, so she only wants me to worry about Emily. If I still couldn't trust her, she had written instructions to call her work number from a public phone using an alias. Although I did trust her, I had some questions and needed to confirm a few things, so I called a few days later. Susan provided a few more details. The reason she told me to call from a public phone with an alias was because she suspected there might already be a wiretap in the office. The alias was also taken into account in case I didn't call from a public phone. And then I was told to take a moment, gather my thoughts, and get back in touch once I was ready. Emily stopped mentioning wanting to go back to her parents' home and started staying at our place. We started having little conversations, gradually, bit by bit. A week after the upheaval, I came home to find Emily and our sons genuinely laughing together. It was the first time I'd seen a smile on Emily's face. I couldn't help but burst into tears. That night, Emily made a confession. She opened up about her past, her inability to defy her father, how her sister had always been there to protect her, and the time she was assaulted. Her sister shielded her whenever she was around, but her father took advantage of the times when she wasn't. She had believed that she couldn't defy her father. She was scared of men, but strangely enough, I was an exception. When I confessed my feelings to her, she was genuinely happy, albeit with complex emotions. But with the support of Emily's sister, she was truly happy to be in a relationship. Around that time, her father was often out of town due to work, so there were fewer opportunities for him to assault her. However, when his assignment ended and he returned home, it was pure terror for Emily. When I proposed to her during this time, she felt like she had no choice but to cling to me. She was taken aback when her father suggested that we live together during our first meeting, but she decided to follow me when I strongly objected. Our marriage was a bliss, until her father insisted that she get a certification. He even threatened to reveal her past to me if she didn't comply. She had no choice but to comply, so she tried her best, but it wasn't enough. Still, she was relieved that she didn't have to go back to her parents' home. Life with me was simply delightful. She was genuinely happy when she became pregnant and we had twins. Initially, Emily's father seemed fond of his grandchildren, which put us at ease. We thought he had changed, but Emily's father hadn't changed after all. He began to separate Emily from me and our children. She was yelled at, threatened, and forced to return every weekend. Eventually, Susan moved back to her parents' home, probably to protect Emily. Then Emily was told to abandon childcare and household chores on weekdays and dump the kids on me. As she obeyed from being threatened as usual, I set up a daycare room in my office. She said she had never felt such despair, even though she blamed herself. To her, it seemed as if even I was trying to distance myself from her children. She blamed herself, and then one day my father-in-law assaulted her. Despite placing a large package in front of the door and doing her best to defend, it was in vain. Just when she was about to give up, Susan, who had sensed something was wrong, entered the room. From then on, my wife had Susan stay in the same room, and she somehow managed to protect herself. The day I went to the scene of a quarrel between my father-in-law and Susan, it seemed her sister was urging her father to release Emily already. Of course, her father got angry and a fight ensued. And then I showed up. When we got home that day, she was overwhelmed with my accepting kindness, and at the same time sensed that I had heard something from Susan. She was grateful to be accepted for who she is, and for our sons, who always enjoyed the meals she cooked. Many times she found herself crying in secret. She sincerely wished to always stay here. We spent all night talking and crying together. When our boys woke up the next morning, they seemed shocked, saying, "Dad, don't bully Mom." Emily started crying all over again, and I joined her. Our sons didn't understand and ended up crying too. We explained that we weren't fighting, but we were just deeply moved. We took the day off work that day and spent a relaxing time as a family. Then I made up my mind and contacted Susan. Surprisingly, all I had to do afterward was leave everything to her. She had not only learned about my father-in-law's unreasonable plans to live with us, but also had evidence of his embezzlement at work. She reported it, and he was arrested. It was reported in the local section of the national newspapers, which eventually led to Emily's parents getting divorced. Thanks to the lawyer that Susan hired, Emily's mother got a hefty amount of alimony and went back to her hometown. Emily's father did not go to prison, but lost everything. At first, he tried to rely on relatives, but nobody would help him when he demanded assistance with his condescending attitude. As a result, he seemed to have retreated to some rural area. After that, Emily, the kids, and I lived peacefully. I think we were a very close-knit family, but unfortunately, our happiness only lasted a few years. Emily passed away in an accident. I was devastated for a while, but with the support of those around me, I managed to pull myself together after a year. During that time, I caused some inconvenience to my business partners, but I somehow worked my way back. And now I'm doing very well, even employing a few people. One of them is a son of one of my business partners who persuaded other partners to help me out because I was struggling, and he kept my business connections intact. I was truly helped by those around me. Another one is Susan, Emily's sister. She helped me in many ways, and now, after losing her job partly because of that, she is working for me as a secretary. And now she is dating one of my staff members, and they've both approached me to discuss the possibility of getting married. I'm thinking of celebrating this with my son, who Emily left behind. The other day, I received a letter from Emily's father. The content was all over the place, but to summarize, it said, "I can come and live with you if you want, and send me compensation and travel expenses right away because I'm coming over." So I immediately had my lawyer send him a warning. At the beginning of the letter, he even apologized, saying, "I was wrong at that time." But he always sends a letter around the anniversary of Emily's death, saying, "It's been a long time now, so the statute of limitations must have expired," right? He's probably still aiming for my earnings. I'm aware that he's in a tough situation and is ostracized by his neighbors because of his bragging. Once our sons grow old enough, I think it's time to settle this myself. Of course, I won't break the law, but I need to show him a further taste of hell. Until then, every time I remember this man, I'm fueled to work harder and get a greater revenge at him. Emily must have had a tough time growing up, being abused by her father since young. Despite having her sister and me to protect her, the fact that she couldn't escape from her father's control might suggest that she was practically brainwashed. Sadly, she passed away early, but I believe that she had a happy time in her last few years as she was able to decisively break away from her father and live peacefully with our children. I am nothing but grateful to Emily's sister who gave me the opportunity to save Emily, and I want her to be happy for Emily's sake from now on. So what's it like to go on a trip abroad with my husband's money?
My sister-in-law, Betty, arrogantly declared,
I wonder how it feels to live not just off your money. I wonder how it feels to live not just off your parents, but also off your brother.
I retorted, feeling a surge of anger at her audacity.
Well, you're one to talk. You're a stay-at-home wife, and yet you hire a maid and don't do any housework at all.
That's enough, both of you. Stop it.
My father stepped in between Betty and me as our argument threatened to escalate. With a calm look on his face, he pacified me and looked up at Betty.
Seems like you can't enjoy your trip with us both here. We'll head back home. Sorry for disturbing.
My name is Lisa. I'm nearing my 40s and work while living with my father. My mother passed away due to illness 10 years ago, and my younger brother, Jake, who is 5 years younger, has already married and left home. I live modestly with my father in our spacious house. It's not that I can't afford to live alone. I choose to live with my father because I'm worried about him. After losing my mother, he started having frequent health issues and was forced to quit his job as he neared retirement. His condition worsened to the point where he wouldn't eat for days unless reminded, and would be bedridden for almost 2 weeks if he fell ill. I couldn't leave my father alone in such a state. At that time, my brother Jake was already working as a lawyer and had a fiancée. Jake and his wife were planning to build a new home near our house, so it was inevitable that I would stay with my father. Jake is exceptionally gifted compared to me. I never thought that the woman he chose as his wife would turn out to be so unreasonable. Jake's wife, Betty, quit her job immediately after their marriage and became a housewife. She leaves all household chores to a hired butler, and her daily routine seems to revolve around luxury lunches and shopping at high-end stores. Jake is busy with work. Perhaps he doesn't have much time to spend with Betty, but her extravagant lifestyle is shocking. Living close to Jake and Betty's house, I couldn't help but hear about Betty's carefree life. What made it more intolerable were her remarks when she visited our house.
When are you planning to leave this house, Lisa? Aren't you embarrassed to live at home at your age?
Betty would mock me like this quite often. I swallowed the words. I don't want to hear that from a housewife who doesn't do housework and just enjoys herself, and responded with a vague smile. I've gotten to the point where I wish she wouldn't come to our house at all, but my father shows sympathy towards Betty, saying Jake might be too busy, and she could be lonely. He doesn't drive her away. Rather, he often invites her to have dinner with us. I wish Jake and my father would show some understanding of the emotional toll this is taking on me. But when I see my father, who is unbothered by Betty's audacious attitude, smiling while eating with her, I can't help but think that as long as he's happy, that's all that matters. Why on earth did Jake marry such a woman? I often wonder, but I suppose there are qualities in Betty that only Jake can appreciate. I purposely ignore Betty's rude remarks and continue eating in silence. That day, as usual, my father invited Betty to have dinner. Jake has been swamped with work lately, and Betty usually helps herself to food left by the housekeeper. My father, perhaps feeling pity for Betty, decided to buy some expensive ingredients and propose that the three of us have a nice meal together. I wasn't particularly thrilled, but if my father insisted, I didn't have a choice. I bought ingredients from the supermarket in town and managed to whip up some dishes I'd never cooked before. My father, who had been losing his appetite, was delighted and laughed, saying, "I'm particularly hungry today." Betty arrived significantly past the agreed-upon time, sank into the dining table chair without so much as a decent greeting. The dishes I had prepared were lined up in front of her.
Now that we're all here, let's eat.
My father cheerfully suggested. Betty didn't seem pleased. She poked at the food with her fork, heaved a big sigh, and said, "Do you think I can eat something that looks this unappetizing?"
Betty shot me a look of contempt as she glanced at the small dishes.
I stared back at Betty, then turned to my father in surprise. My father also looked surprised, his mouth agape as he looked at Betty.
Well, it may not be as good as the meals your housekeeper makes, but Lisa made this from scratch. Can't you be a bit more polite?
When my father sternly rebutted, Betty immediately pulled a sour face.
I never said I wanted to eat with you guys. I'm helping you make some memories, and you served me something that looks so unappetizing. Can't you consider my feelings a bit?
I muttered, but Betty picked up on it quickly. Betty looked down on me and my father, smirked, and said something unthinkable.
Well, your father won't live much longer, right? I'm the diligent daughter-in-law keeping him company, so I expect a generous inheritance.
At this, both my father and I were left speechless. The living room fell silent. Could this really be the woman that the intelligent Jake chose to marry? Discussing inheritance before someone's even passed away? There's something wrong. Before I knew it, I was shouting. Even Betty, who had been grumpily picking at her gratin, stopped when she saw me letting my anger out.
Dad, you're gonna live for many more decades.
My father gently held me back as I leaned over the table. Panting heavily, I slowly sat back down. My anger towards Betty was still swirling inside my chest. With a deep breath that seemed to pierce my father's mood, I felt my pent-up emotions deflate.
I'll pretend I didn't hear what you just said.
My father said in an emotionless voice,
All I did was state the facts. I don't want the inheritance taken away by a woman who's still living in her parents' house.
Betty's words were so refreshingly straightforward, I no longer had the energy to be angry. She bravely rehashed what my father had tried to let slide, and threw her demeaning words and actions at us.
I'll leave this rundown house to you, sister-in-law. Looks like you won't be losing your place to live.
Betty's shrill laughter echoed. I wanted to retaliate with a complaint, but when I saw my father quietly shaking his head, I swallowed my words. My father was too lenient with Betty. Even though she might be lonely with Jake, often busy with work, it's not right to sympathize with an adult who can't tell what's appropriate to say and what's not. My father looked at my face and muttered softly, "She's the one Jake chose." My father smiled with a hint of sadness. He looked like a father dealing with a troublesome daughter, and also like a man completely worn out by life. I couldn't say anything when I saw my father's face. I had things to say to both my father and Betty, but I wanted to know what Jake thought about all this more than anything. Does Jake know about Betty's behavior? If he's aware of it, and just letting it slide, I have to say something as his sister. In the end, Betty barely touched the food I made, and left early after a brief conversation. Only my father and I were left in the large living room.
Creating memories, huh? Maybe she's right.
I quietly exhaled as I noticed my father's figure suddenly seeming smaller when he murmured that. A month later, due to Jake's suggestion, our family decided to go on a trip to France. My father wanted to go to France while he could still walk on his own, so Jake and I planned the trip. Of course, I initially asked Jake to take Dad and go on the trip with just the three of them without me. Betty would always make snide comments toward me if I was present. I didn't want to ruin the cheerful atmosphere of the trip. However, Jake insisted that it would be best to have someone who usually observes father's condition, so he ended up purchasing 4 tickets. I reluctantly agreed to accompany them on the trip to France, and as I expected, Betty was in a bad mood the whole time and didn't exchange a single word with anyone on the plane. Once we landed, we went straight to the heart of Paris and enjoyed sightseeing. My father was unbelievably energetic, exploring everywhere. Betty seemed to lighten up a bit when Jake bought her a brand-name bag. She walked arm in arm with Jake, but I couldn't help but notice that Jake didn't look particularly happy. At that moment, I accidentally made eye contact with Betty. She glared at me so fiercely that my heart jumped.
By the way, why is Lisa here with us?
Betty let go of Jake's arm and confronted me.
I asked her to come in case something happens to Dad. We need someone who can handle it.
Jake tried to step in to help, but it seemed like his words didn't reach Betty. She kept staring at me, snickering.
Hey, what's it like to go on a trip overseas with my husband's money? Airfare isn't cheap, so don't be extravagant.
Betty said arrogantly.
We're staying in a suite at the hotel, but it would be fine for Lisa to sleep outside, right?
Jake called Betty's name sharply, trying to stop her.
How does it feel to live not only off your parents, but also off your brother?
I felt the blood rush to my head at that comment.
Betty, you're the one living off Jake. Even though you're a housewife, you hired a housemaid and don't do any housework.
Enough. Both of you stop it.
My father intervened just as Betty and I were about to get into a quarrel. With a serene expression, Dad calmed me down, glancing at Betty.
It seems our presence is spoiling your trip. We'll go home. Sorry for disturbing you. Lisa, could you check the bus schedule to the airport?
Without anger or distress, he calmly made his declaration. A smile spread across Betty's face while a look of panic raced across Jake's.
Wait a minute. What should we do when you guys are gone?
Jake had a sudden realization and tried desperately to keep us from leaving. However, once Dad decided to go home, his resolution was firm. He had me check the bus to the airport, and he quickly set off in the opposite direction towards the bus stop. I had no choice but to follow Dad, while keeping an eye on my brother and his wife.
We'll be just fine without the old man and old lady.
Betty's voice echoed from behind us. I was momentarily angered at Betty treating Dad as an old man, but I had no time to waste on her. I chased after Dad, who was walking ahead, while hearing Jake's cries of anguish and Betty's insults thrown at him. 2 hours later, Jake barged into the cafe near the airport where we were having tea, looking desperate. His forehead was covered in an extraordinary amount of sweat, signaling something was amiss. In a frenzy, Jake rushed to our table and bowed his head to us.
I'm sorry about earlier. I'll apologize properly later, but for now, I need help.
Jake bowed deeply, pleading with Dad. Dad and I looked at each other in surprise. When I asked in place of Dad, Jake began to explain with renewed energy what happened after we left. After we boarded the bus to the airport, Jake and Betty took a taxi to the hotel. The problem occurred after they got in the taxi. The English that worked at the tourist spots didn't seem to work with the taxi driver. Neither of them spoke French, and they couldn't understand what the driver was saying. The driver was asking them something, but they responded without really understanding. As a result, Jake said that when he paid the money and got off, the driver drove away with Betty still inside.
I can't get through to Betty on the phone. She might have been mugged or something after she was dropped off.
Jake said, his face turning pale, probably figuring it would be faster to rely on us rather than trying to cope on his own, and winding up out of his depth. Jake, who doesn't understand French, asked for our help. My father and I can speak French perfectly. Betty appears to think of my father as an old man who can't do anything, but he used to be a French teacher. And I too am a current French teacher. This trip to France was planned by Jake, wanting my father to reminisce about his youth. Once my father arrived in France, he seemed filled with nostalgia and vitality, perhaps remembering his time studying abroad. Since I too had studied abroad in France during my student days, after parting ways with my brother and his wife, we slowly talked about our time studying here. My father listened to the stories with a serious expression and eventually gave a slow nod.
Let's return to the city center. I bet the taxi that dropped you guys off is waiting for its next fare there.
With my father's command, we quickly got ready and set off on a journey to find Betty, who had been left somewhere. My father and I split up to look for the taxi that had dropped off my brother and his wife after returning to the city center. Most taxi drivers speak French without resorting to English. Before me, my father found the taxi that had taken them and quickly arrived at the location where Betty was said to have been dropped off. Fortunately, Betty was there, exactly where she had been dropped off, unhurt, slumped over. It was good that she was uninjured, but as soon as she arrived, she seemed to have been pickpocketed, and all her bags and valuables were gone, leaving her sitting there penniless. When Betty saw Jake's face, tears welled up in her eyes, but she quickly scowled when she saw us.
What are they doing here?
Betty, who was plainly grumpy, asked Jake, and he sighed heavily.
If it weren't for the two of them, you'd have been left here penniless forever. You know? Show some gratitude.
Betty's eyes rounded in doubt.
What do you mean?
Without them, our trip would have been a disaster. You and I, we can't speak French. That's why we ended up like this. But these two are different. Both are French teachers, far better than me.
Betty looked uncomfortable, her gaze flitting over to us. A bad thought sprouted in me and I dropped the quiet words to Betty. If we hadn't found you, you might have been sleeping rough here. Betty bit her lip in frustration.
And also, the expenses for the trip were split equally between Jake and me. How's that? An overseas trip fully enjoyed on the money of an old lady living at her parents'?
At this, Betty's shoulders began to shake.
It's your father's money anyway, isn't it?
To Betty's counter-argument, my father gently shook his head.
I didn't do anything. Lisa and Jake, they're doing well on their own. They're my pride and joy.
Just when I thought Betty was glaring at me intently, she fell silent without saying a word. Even though she had been helped, she didn't utter a single word of thanks. I had a mountain of things I wanted to say to her, but my father's whispering, "Take it easy," made me hold back and keep my mouth shut. For Betty, this must have been an incredibly humiliating event. She must not have expected to be saved by the one she had been looking down upon. Even Jake seemed fed up with Betty's stubborn antagonism towards us, his face showing clear signs of frustration.
Well, now that the issue has been resolved, shall we resume sightseeing? Let's go to a restaurant I used to frequent when I was studying here, my father suggested cheerfully.
At my father's bright words, the family was once again united. We ignored the depressed Betty and thoroughly enjoyed our trip in France. Upon our return to the States, Jake was constantly apologizing to us, and he surprisingly and abruptly divorced Betty. Shocked, I asked him why they had married in the first place. Apparently, Jake had married Betty because she claimed to be pregnant and insisted he take responsibility. After they married, it turned out that her claim of being pregnant was a lie. However, Jake said he couldn't easily file for divorce due to concerns about his public image. However, his patience with Betty, who looked down on my father and me, had run its course, leading him to decide on the divorce. After the divorce, Betty was kicked out of their new home and couldn't continue her life as a housewife anymore. Of course, there was no maid to take care of the housework for her. What's more, due to a pickpocket incident during our trip to France, Betty ended up losing half her assets. She must be working hard, breaking a sweat by now. My father, remembering his younger days during our trip to France, became noticeably more cheerful and lively. I quit my long-term teaching job at school, and I'm now busy running a French language school at home after some renovations. I'm hoping that my father will also teach French in our school someday. Our dreams as a family continue to expand. Infertility treatment? What a waste of money. If we're infertile, the cause must be you. My husband hurled those harsh words at me and in the end dropped a massive bombshell.
I'm going to divorce my infertile wife and marry your sister instead. Haha.
Indeed, my husband chose his sister-in-law over his infertile wife. My name is Linda. I live with my husband Nathan. Days spent with my beloved husband were indeed happy days, however we had a hard time trying to have a baby. The discussion about infertility treatment began about 2 years into our marriage.
Hey Nathan, I think it's time we started thinking about having a baby.
Huh?
Nathan responded with a lack of enthusiasm.
Infertility treatment comes with various burdens, right? Both physically and financially.
That's true, but if it's going to help us conceive, I think it's okay to give it a try.
Well, maybe, but
Nathan didn't deny the idea of infertility treatment, but he was also not eager to proactively engage in it. I had become a housewife when Nathan had transferred for his job, so I guess he has financial concerns.
Don't worry about the money. It's been 6 months since we moved and I'm getting used to this place. I'm thinking about finding a job soon, so we don't have to worry so much about finance, right?
If I can start earning an income, we'll have more financial flexibility than we do now. With that, he would probably become more open-minded and supportive towards the treatment, but he reacted differently than I expected.
well, it'd be great if you could start working. Well, it would be great if you could start working.
But
I don't know how I feel about you finding a job for the sake of getting treatments. It's like putting the cart before the horse. Do most people conceive naturally?
that's not necessarily true. Women's bodies aren't that simple.
I hear that when couples can't have kids, the cause is usually the female.
Slightly irritated by Nathan's words, I responded,
I do hear that often. But there are cases where the male may be the cause, you know? Alcohol, obesity, even diseases from childhood can cause male infertility.
He frowned disapprovingly.
Maybe, But statistically speaking, it's more likely to be the female, right? I mean, I haven't had any major illnesses, and I only drink socially. I doubt the issue is with me.
So you're saying, you think it's my fault?
I didn't say that. I'm just generally speaking.
Even though he didn't say it outright, it was clear that he believed I was the reason for our infertility. But it was true that I couldn't rule out the possibility that there might be factors on my side, so I went to get an infertility test at the hospital. To make matters worse, my mother-in-law was standing outside our door waiting for me when I returned home.
Linda, where have you been? You're a housewife, and yet you're always out. Hurry up and let me in, it's terribly hot outside.
My mother-in-law always visits without notice, keeping tabs on me. Regardless of how well I kept up with the household chores, she consistently found something to criticize, pointing out things like, "This spot is dirty," and "This isn't good enough." Reluctantly, I let her in, and the first thing she said was,
So, I hear you've decided to start infertility treatment?
Huh. Why do you know about that?
I obviously heard it from my son.
Is that so?
I was planning to wait and assess the situation before bringing up the topic with my husband again, so the fact that he had already talked about it with his mother was a surprise.
You see, we let you marry our son for the sake of our family's heir, yet 2 years after marriage, you still haven't managed to get pregnant. I don't even know why we approved this marriage in the first place.
I apologize for not having been able to bless you with a grandchild yet. But Nathan and I are committed to making every effort to conceive in the near future.
Upon hearing my non-confrontational response, my mother-in-law let out a deep sigh.
Linda dear, if trying hard was all it took to get pregnant, no one would have any trouble, right? After all, it's clear that you're the cause of this infertility, so maybe you should consider a divorce or something.
What? Divorce?
It makes sense, doesn't it? There's no way my son is the cause.
Like mother, like son. Not only my husband, but also my mother-in-law doubted that I was the cause. Currently satisfied with her outburst, my mother-in-law left for the day. Upon my husband's return from work, I relayed the comments made by his mother.
See, even Mom says the problem isn't me. If we're infertile, it must be you, Linda.
He responded with a smug look while nodding in agreement. There was no point in fighting back. He wouldn't consider the possibility that he might be at fault, not even for a second. I decided to wait for my infertility test results. I visited the hospital again a few days later, where the doctor told me a surprising fact.
So we didn't find any issues with you.
Is that so? But then why?
The doctor began awkwardly.
Please have a talk with your husband. If you really want a baby, it would be best for him to also get tested.
Have my husband get tested?
We can't definitively say the cause lies with just one of you. However, pregnancy is something that requires cooperation from both spouses. Just to be sure, I recommend that your husband also get tested.
Is that so?
While I was relieved at the doctor's words, I wondered how to break the news to my husband. If I tried to be roundabout, it would only make things more complicated. I've got the test results. Let's talk about it tonight. I texted him and decided to wait for him to come home. As I was preparing dinner, my husband returned. Behind my husband, inexplicably, stood my mother-in-law as well.
Eh? Mother-in-law? Why?
I invited her. When I told her that the test results were out, she said she wanted to come.
My husband had a look of ease on his face. They appear completely oblivious to the possibility that he might be the cause.
Linda, hurry up and tell us the results, although I can already guess without asking, haha.
To my smirking mother-in-law, I responded clearly. There were no issues with me. The doctor suggested Nathan also get tested.
Huh? Why me?
Faced with the unexpected turn of events, my husband was obviously dissatisfied.
What do you mean, why? Pregnancy is something a couple has to work on together, isn't it? I had no issues, so now it's your turn to get checked.
What's that supposed to mean? Are you saying the problem is with me?
That's not what I'm saying. If we both get tested and neither of us is the issue, that's reassuring. If by any chance you are the issue, then we just have to get the proper treatment.
As I tried to appease my angry husband, my mother-in-law interrupted.
Stop this nonsense. Nathan has always been healthy. there have never been any issues with him. It's impossible for him to be the cause.
It seemed as though she hadn't been listening to a word I said, as she stubbornly insisted that her son was not the issue. To convince them both, I showed them the medical report I received from the doctor.
Look, I got this today. It clearly shows that they didn't find anything.
Yet, both Nathan and my mother-in-law casually glanced over the report, showing little interest in actually reading it thoroughly. Clearly, they were reluctant to accept the reality.
Women are the ones who get pregnant, so the problem must be with you.
Wait a second, I just showed you the test results.
His mother once again interjected, shrugging her shoulders in disbelief.
This must be a fake report anyway, right? Going to such extremes just to avoid a divorce, you're truly a frightening woman.
What? Why would I do such a thing? Stop saying ridiculous things.
Ignoring my protest, the two continued their conversation. Hey Nathan, wouldn't a younger woman be better?
Maybe. This could be good timing.
Oh yeah, with her? Strike while the iron is hot, as they say.
With her? What were these people talking about? A few minutes later, an unbelievable fact slipped out of Nathan's mouth.
Well, actually, I've impregnated your sister.
What?
We recently found out she's pregnant. If I were infertile, she wouldn't be pregnant, right?
My sister's pregnant?
I was so stunned that I couldn't think straight. Nathan continued without paying attention to my state.
So here's the thing. I'm thinking of marrying your sister. Mom has been saying she wants a grandchild soon after all.
My mind went blank and I felt like collapsing right then and there. An affair with my sister? And she's pregnant. And they're gonna get married.
Wait, Sarah's still in college and she has a boyfriend.
Yeah, but apparently she fell for me.
When did this?
We've been seeing each other for a while now.
Nathan revealed the cruel truth nonchalantly. He was having an affair with my sister while we were discussing our infertility issues. Abandoned by my husband and betrayed even by my own sister. I had no idea any of this was happening while we were discussing our infertility. My mother-in-law further compounded my already speechless state with her insults.
Do you understand now? My son is perfectly capable of getting a woman pregnant, so you're the issue. We don't need a wife who can't bear children.
That's true.
Nathan agreed with his mother.
It's settled then. We're getting a divorce. I already have the papers. Fill them out quickly.
He seemed thrilled as he thrust the divorce papers at me. Are these people sane? Impregnating your wife's sister and planning to remarry? That's outrageous. That's when I felt it. The surge of anger that I can't even put into words.
Fine. We'll get a divorce, but you're gonna pay me alimony.
Once we agreed, he immediately kicked me out of our home.
See you around, you barren lady. I'll find happiness with your adorable sister.
Later, I returned to my parents' home and explained the situation to them. They were enraged, but the truth is, they disowned my sister a long time ago. I was the only family member that my sister still had contact with. Her reckless behavior, particularly concerning money and relationships, had caused our parents a great deal of trouble. She was disowned by her parents once she started college. Nevertheless, she is my one and only sister. I regularly invited her to our home for meals with my husband, and this is how things ended up. My parents said they summoned Sarah and my husband to give them a scolding, but I told them that was unnecessary. I knew that even if they got together, it wouldn't work out. And several years later, it was a few years later when I got remarried to Gary, someone I met at my new job. We were soon blessed with a daughter. One day when we were out as a family, I heard a voice say, "Hey Linda, is that you?"
Eh? Nathan?
Long time no see.
The voice belonged to my ex-husband. He took a quick glance at my daughter, and then me.
Ah, so you remarried. Lucky you, someone took you in. Mind your own business. How's your marriage with my sister going?
At this, my ex-husband made a sour face, just as I thought. I pretended to know nothing and asked him, "What's with the face?" "You should be happy you ended up with a child with my sister instead of me."
Well, you see,
He replied with a pale face.
Sarah was really unfaithful. Even after she gave birth, she used my money to cheat on me. Now we're divorced. She even took our child with her after all the baby stuff she made me buy.
Oh dear, that sounds like quite a disaster for you.
I replied, though I knew all along. I was aware of my sister's promiscuous behavior, which resulted in numerous troubles. Every time, she ended up demanding money from our parents. Looking around and seeing that my daughter and husband weren't around, my ex-husband suddenly turned to me.
Hey, would you consider giving us another chance?
Excuse me? Don't you think it's a little too late for that? As you can see, I'm remarried.
But your daughter's a stepchild, right? You shouldn't have to go through the trouble of caring for someone else's child. I don't need children anymore. Let's live freely together.
He must have thought that my daughter was my stepdaughter. This man, after all this time, still didn't suspect my fertility. I boldly told this mistaken man the truth.
What are you talking about? That girl's my biological daughter.
Huh.
His expression at that moment is something I can never forget, even to this day. He had a dumbfounded look, about 5 times more than usual.
Weren't you infertile?
Trembling, he asked. I explained politely.
Well, isn't it unfortunate? We conceived our daughter right after I married my husband. But more importantly, I wonder who the actual father of Sarah's child is.
I looked at my ex-husband with a wicked smile. His face was pale.
Hey, what do you mean by that?
Oh, don't worry about it. Just curious, you know? I knew my sister was promiscuous. I also knew the cause of her infertility was you. In other words, you were used by my sister.
Used?
Yes, she probably didn't care who she was marrying as long as she had a man to raise her child. And you, who misunderstood, fell into my sister's scheme and married her, unknowingly raising another man's child.
So, you mean I was deceived into being a surrogate father?
He fell to the ground and clung to me, crying inconsolably.
Please, you're the only one for me. I was abandoned by Sarah, my child, even my own mother. I'll end up all alone. That's the result of your actions, right? It's quite pathetic to be acting this way for someone your age.
I looked down and threw those words at him. He slumped his shoulders, completely disheartened. Ever since, despite our conversation, he has kept sending me desperate texts.
I was wrong. I want to start over. You're the only one for me. Please come back. I won't cheat anymore.
But I blocked all of them without replying. It seems my ex-husband later requested a DNA test for the child. As a result, it was confirmed that the child was not his. To this day, he's in a state of self-isolation at home, not even going to work. Being abandoned by his mother, his only ally, feels like he's getting what he deserves. I of course haven't seen my ex-husband since that day. I have a family that is incomparably more precious. I couldn't care less about that man. I want to continue to prioritize my husband, who chose me, and our daughter, who came into our lives, focusing on them as we cherish each day.